Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 25, The Asylum. This episode centres around James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald and their descendants, and their youngest son Francis Patrick Grogan, who was my husband's great-great-grandfather. Just a warning, this episode does contain distressing information. It has been quite frustrating to research the Grogan family, as at this point I can't go further back than James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald, and there have been a lot of gaps. There has recently been some discoverings, particularly with the help of the Goulburn Historical Society. You would think with the surname of Grogan to search for that it wouldn't have been a common surname back in the 1850s in Australia. However, the further that I delved, the more I realised that there were quite a few Grogans, particularly in the Goulburn area, and those did not seem to connect to the James Grogan in my husband's family tree. James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald married on the 4th of February 1852 in Goulburn, New South Wales, at St Peter and Paul's Catholic Church. Very little information was given on the marriage certificate. There were no ages listed. There were no details of the parents of the bride nor the groom. And for James, all that it stated was that his abode was at Breadalbane, 20 minutes west of Goulburn, and Mary was residing at Goulburn at the time of their marriage. Mary was born in Ireland in about 1820, so she was about 32 when she married James. At this stage, I'm unable to locate a birth certificate for James Grogan. James and Mary had their first child, William, on the 9th of February 1853 at Mummel, a small town 20 minutes northwest of Goulburn. William was baptised on the 4th of March 1853 in Goulburn at St Peter and Paul Church. Their second child, Anne, was possibly born on the 16th of December 1854. It was registered in 1855, and she was baptised on the 1st of March 1855 in Queanbeyan. Anne died at the age of 2 on the 8th of August 1857 in Goulburn. Their third child, Julia, was born on the 30th of September 1856 in Goulburn, and she was baptised at the parish of St Peter and Paul in Goulburn. By around 1860, John and the family had moved to El Dorado Station near Chiltern in Victoria. And this is where there's some distressing information, so just some forewarning at this point. Little Julia was drowned by her mother in the Black Dog Creek near Chiltern on the 16th of October 1860 at the age of 4 years. And I'm going to cross now to some articles that outline this event. On the 27th of October 1860, so a week after the drowning, there was an article in the Ovens Constitution. It's titled "Singular Case of Child Murder." A coroner's inquest was held at the courthouse in Chiltern on Monday afternoon into the death of Julia Grogan, a child 4 years of age, who was drowned by its mother in the Black Dog Creek on Tuesday the 16th. The mother was in custody before the court, the jury having viewed the body, and then the following evidence was adduced. James Grogan deposed that the prisoner was his wife. The body shown to the jury was that of Julia Grogan, the daughter of the witness and the prisoner. The child was saw last alive on Monday morning on the 15th at his hut on the El Dorado station. He had been absent from home for some time and returned on Friday the 12th of October. His wife did not appear to be in her right mind. She said to him that she was afraid the troopers were going to take her. On Monday the 16th, she went away to Mr. Docker's at Wangaratta. The prisoner was a very sober woman. James told Mr. Atkins before going away that he was afraid that his wife was not in her right senses. William Pinkerton, the agent for Mr. J.D. Atkin of the El Dorado station, deposed that on Tuesday morning He and Mr. Atkin, having been told that Mrs. Grogan was wandering about in a state of insanity, went in search of her. They found her about a mile from her own place, close alongside the Beechworth Road. She had only 3 children with her. Mr. Atkin asked her what she had done with the other. She said, "I've drowned it. I can't help it." The little boy, apparently about 8 years of age, pointed to a water hole, and this would have been William, in which he said that his mother had drowned the child. They went to the water hole and saw tracks of bare feet around it. The prisoner was barefooted. James Grogan and Mr. Atkin stripped and went into the water, but were unable to recover the body. Atkin had known the prisoner for some time. She was a most temperate woman, but she had been noted for an eccentric manner. Susan Gallagher deposed that on Monday night the 15th, the prisoner came to her place in Black Dog Creek with her 4 children and wanted to remain there. Susan told her to go home. The prisoner then went into the fowl house and Susan told her to come into the hut. She allowed the children to be taken in but ran away herself. Susan pursued and found her and then asked her to come in and stay all night. And she said, "There's been a murder done down there. You'd better look into it." She then came into the house and remained for 2 hours when she again ran away. When Susan again caught her, Mary said to her, "Don't touch me, the devil's in me." She also said that it would be better to drown all the children, but that she hadn't the power to do it herself and wanted Susan to help her. Susan sat up with her all Monday night. On Tuesday morning, Mary appeared better and, having had some breakfast, went away with her children about 8 a.m. Susan told Mr. Atkins of the prisoner's strange behaviour. About 3 weeks ago, the prisoner came to Susan's place, clapping her hands, and said that her husband put an end to himself. Ellen Ferring deposed that on Tuesday morning on the 16th, about 10 o'clock, the prisoner came to her place and said that she drowned one of her children. She also said that the devil had a fast grip of her. John Lane gave evidence respecting the prisoner's conduct immediately before the fatal occurrence, by which it appeared that she was labouring under the belief that her husband had been killed and herself turned out of her home. Constable Duffy deposed that on Saturday he found the body of a child floating in a waterhole in the Black Dog Creek. It was dressed. Dr. Dempster deposed that he made a post-mortem examination. There were no marks of violence. He believed the death had been caused by drowning. He had conversed with the prisoner and she appeared melancholy but not positively insane. From the statements of others, he believed she was suffering from puerperal mania, which is what we would call postnatal depression today. The coroner pointed out to the jury that it was not their duty to inquire into the prisoner's insanity. If they believed she had drowned the child, it would be their duty to return a verdict of wilful murder, and the circuit court would decide whether she was liable for the act when it was committed. The jury, after a brief consultation, returned a verdict of murder, but stated that they believed the prisoner to have been insane when she drowned the child. The prisoner was then committed for trial. So 4 days later, it was mentioned in the Beechworth Police Court, Mary Grogan, on a charge of lunacy, was remanded for 7 days. This unfortunate female stands charged with the murder of her infant at the Indigo. While in custody at the Beechworth jail, she also attempted to destroy a second child, a babe in arms, which was John, by throwing him into a water closet, which is what we would see as a toilet today. The Solicitor General had neglected to forward intimation as to whether she would be tried for infanticide, and in consequence the bench did not exactly know how to act in the matter, hence the remand. And in the Ovens and Murray Advertiser in Beechworth on the 31st of October, Mary Grogan. Mr. Oggier on Tuesday applied to His Honour Sir Redmond Barry to take bail in the case of Mrs. Mary Grogan. He was on Monday put up for trial for the murder of one of her children. The court allowed bail, either the husband in £200 or 3 sureties in £100 each. Such bail to be taken before Justice of the Peace and in the presence of the prisoner. The bail to appear in the next circuit court at Beechworth. The Crown Prosecutor expressed his acquiescence in the course about to be taken. Their son, John James Grogan, was born in 1860 at Black Dog Creek, and as mentioned, this was the baby referred to that she tried to drown while in custody. As a result, Mary was found under the charge of lunacy and was placed in the Yarra Bend Asylum for 12 months. And she returned late. So the Ovens and Murray Advertiser, Beechworth, on the 30th of January 1861, there's an article that says that John Grogan was charged with neglecting to maintain a child. Mr. Cassiu sworn that the defendant's wife is now in jail on a charge of murder at the Black Dog Creek, and the child is now nursing government expense and in consequence in ill health. Mr. Cassiu stated that Grogan had been asked to take the child, but he said he wished to be compelled. The bench ordered the restoration of the child to the father. In response, Grogan said, "In the name of God, I'll take it." Because she had an infant child and she'd obviously attempted murder on that child in custody, they were keen to ensure that James took possession of the child and the maintenance of the child while Mary was away. So on the 26th of October 1861 in the Melbourne Herald, there was an article and it says, "A recovered lunatic." Our readers will remember the case of Mary Grogan, who was arrested some time ago on a charge of child murder near Chiltern, and who, becoming insane, was forwarded to the Yarra Bend Asylum. Having now recovered, she was brought to Beechworth yesterday and is to take her trial at the ensuing circuit court on the above charge. We understand that this unfortunate woman was brought from Melbourne on the regular coach, and we must earnestly protest against the government in employing this means of conveyance for criminals and lunatics in charge of the police. There was no inconvenience endured in this case, but we put it to anyone who knows what a 30 hours journey in Cobb's coaches is like, whether it be right for ladies and young children to be compelled to travel in such company. This is not the first time we have heard of public conveyance being employed for such a purpose, and we certainly think some steps should be taken to bring the matter under the notice of those whom it may concern. So in the Ovens and Murray Advertiser in Beechworth on the 24th of October 1861, the late child murder at Chiltern. In the list of those for trial at the present sitting of the Circuit Court, we perceive the name of Mary Grogan for murder at Chiltern. This woman was charged at the last Circuit Court with the murder by drowning of one of her children. She was not then considered in proper state of mind to be tried and was sent to the Lunatic Asylum, Melbourne, from whence she has returned recovered yesterday. So at this point, there's very little that is covered by either James Grogan or Mary Grogan once she returns. We know that they did have further children, so they did remain together in the area. I'm not sure whether Mary was charged and incarcerated for that offence. However, she did give birth to her next child in 1863. So if she was incarcerated, it was for less than 2 years. There is a record of a Mary Grogan's death in 1884. It's listed that she has a husband, James, and a child, Francis P., so it matches with her son and her husband. However, this is difficult to substantiate as there's no record in the births, deaths and marriages. James Grogan's death has been recorded on the 10th of September 1892. There was an article in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Express stating that James had died at Kentucky Station near Corowa, and it states that he had made New South Wales his home for 40 years and he was buried at the Hopefield Cemetery. His son, John James Grogan, the baby referred to in the articles earlier, was living at Hopefield at this time. John James Grogan, their son, obviously did not know the whereabouts of the oldest child, William, at this time, because he placed an ad in the Albury papers searching for William's address and asking for any information about where William would be, because he wanted to let his brother know that their father had died. So William at this stage obviously didn't have contact with the family. So I'm just going to go into a little more detail with the children of James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald. So as mentioned, William Grogan is a bit of a mystery. He obviously grew up to be an adult because he would have been 39 years old when his father died, when the ad was placed in the paper by his brother John James. But I'm unable to find any census records, no death record, no marriage record for William at this point. Anne and Julia, the second and third born children, didn't survive childhood, as I outlined earlier. And then that takes us to the next child, John James, who'd placed the ad. So he was recorded in New South Wales at the age of 14, no doubt working. And he married Bridget in New South Wales in 1884, aged 24. Now, there's no record of him marrying a Bridget in the marriage records in Victoria or New South Wales. The only reference I have of this is when John James was hospitalised at Liverpool, and he stated that his wife was Bridget and that he was 24 when he married her. And he was 56 at the time that he stated this. His children are all accurately listed. However, the records do show that John James married Elizabeth Schmittenbecker in Albury in January 1855, 12 months after the date that he said that he had married Bridget in 1886. Elizabeth Schmittenbecker was born in 1854 in New South Wales. John and Elizabeth had 5 children. However, Elizabeth was forced to place 2 warrants for desertion on John, one in 1894 and one in 1899. So the first Gazette article in 1894 states, Albury. A warrant has been issued by the Albury bench for the arrest of John James Grogan, charged with unlawfully deserting his wife, Elizabeth Grogan, at Albury during the past 6 months, leaving her without means of support. He is about 34 years of age, 6 foot high, 14 stone, fair complexion, clean-shaved except a brown moustache, a labourer, supposed to have gone to Corowa or Jindera harvesting. He was arrested in May 1894 and ordered to pay maintenance for 12 months. And instead of paying maintenance, he's obviously returned because another child was born in 1896. However, in 1899, another Gazette article features in Albury, a warrant has been issued by the Albury bench for the arrest of John Grogan, charged with unlawfully deserting his wife Elizabeth Grogan at Albury since June. He's 43 years of age, 5 foot 10 or 6 foot high, medium build, fair complexion, brown hair turning grey, a Victorian, a labourer, dressed when last seen in an old grey suit, may go to the shearing sheds on the Murrumbidgee. If this man is found at work, the warrant should not be executed at once, but Grogan may be induced to send maintenance to his wife as early as possible. John, it seems, did not return to the family in 1899, with his youngest child being only 3. John was recorded as being jailed in Hay, New South Wales, and listed as no fixed place of address for insulting language, and was jailed for 48 hours on the 25th of May 1914. He was then recorded as an inmate at the Liverpool State Hospital in Sydney in April 1916. In 1918, he was fined at Cootamundra, New South Wales, when he hit a night railway worker with a beer bottle while intoxicated. He had a ticket to go from Junee to Sydney, but his reason for being in Cootamundra, he said that there was no room on the train. In November 1920, he was arrested for stealing a glass from the Exchange Hotel in Wagga, and he is recorded as living in Wagga in the 1930 census. On the 14th of May 1931 at Miranda, which is near Boree Creek, it was reported that John died at the property Pine Park, 9 miles from Miranda. He'd camped there for 3 weeks prior to his death. He was about to ride his horse into town to get his pension when workers found him dead in the paddock, and he was aged 71. Interestingly, this is the area where his youngest brother lived. However, at that stage, in 1931, his brother was living in Wagga, and his younger brother had died by 1932. There doesn't seem to be evidence that John James and his brother Francis Patrick, the youngest in the family, had really any contact with each other. So it doesn't mention anything in the paper about his children, his wife, or any other siblings. There is no record of Elizabeth's death. She possibly remarried after John's desertion. There could quite possibly have been an annulment of their marriage along the way. She must have died after 1933 though, as she was mentioned in her daughter Hilda's wedding announcement, and it said the late John Grogan, but it doesn't refer to Elizabeth as having passed at that point. So with John James and Elizabeth's children, their first child, Francis Joseph, was born in Albury in 1886. He enlisted in World War I on the 27th of July 1915 at Albury, but was rejected due to defective eyesight. There's very little on Francis, where he lived or what his occupation was. He is recorded as dying in 1955 at Healesville, aged 68. Ellen was the second born child, and she was born in 1888 in Albury. She married Robert Massey in Albury on the 31st of October 1906. Robert was a farmer at Indigo, near Rutherglen. They had a son, Leslie Thomas Massey, who was born in Chiltern in February 1915. And Leslie enlisted in World War II on the 23rd of July 1942 and listed his occupation as textile worker. He didn't marry and lived with his mother after his father's death in 1955 in Albury, and Leslie died on the 21st of February 2001 in Albury. The third child of John James and Elizabeth was James A. Grogan, and he was born on the 16th of October 1888 in Albury. In 1916 he worked as a railway worker at Cootamundra, and he married Isabella Mary Bean in Wagga, who was 22 years younger than James. He married her on the 18th of September 1940 when he was 51. They had 3 children, and James died in Wagga, New South Wales in 1969 at the age of 80. Elizabeth Ann Grogan was born on the 18th of June 1891 at Corowa, and she married Thomas Stanley Morton in Albury in June 1922 when she was 30, and they had 3 sons. William Thomas was born in 1923 and died at the age of 12 on the 18th of September 1935 in Albury from pneumonia. Alan Francis was born on the 1st of August 1925 in Albury, and he was in the Navy and was an ordinary seaman on the HMAS Bathurst. He died on the 12th of August 1944, aged 19, at Sri Lanka, and is buried at Colombo. And their third son, Victor Joseph Morton, was born on the 19th of October 1929 in Albury and died in 1986, aged 56, in Albury. He was a storeman and lived with his parents. He didn't marry, and so he's buried with his brother Willie. So out of the 3 children that Elizabeth Ann Grogan had with Thomas Morton, unfortunately for her, there's no descendants. There were no grandchildren from those 3 children. The youngest child of John James and Elizabeth Grogan was Mary Hilda. She was born in 1896 in Albury, and she married Percy Rosewarne in Goulburn, New South Wales in 1932. Percy fought in World War I in France, and he died at the age of only 45 in 1940. He was wounded in the neck at Pozières and was invalidated and sent back to Australia. Percy wrote a letter to his cousin Nellie Rigby of Currawong, and she placed it in the paper. And it says, Miss Nellie Rigby of Currawong has received a letter from her cousin, Private Percy E. Rosewarne, 19th Battalion, who, like all the other Australian soldiers, is enthusiastic over the fair land of France. Private Rosewarne mentions that he's only received 1 letter since leaving Australia. Speaking of conditions, he says the camp is good and there is plenty of good food. Butter and cheese are supplied. Things are very dear, except pipes and tobacco, which are very cheap. Tobacco and cigarettes are issued every week. A washing parade is held weekly, and hot water and soap are provided. Private Rosewarne says there are plenty of Goulburn men that he knows in France, and one of them got a VC for bringing him wounded under heavy shell fire. The battalion gets a very good drill of the latest type. And then there's a letter received by Frank Mooney of Spring Valley with his brother, Private John Mooney, from France, and it says, "We're having a spell out in the trenches after having a stretch of the hottest fighting yet, or hope to be in again. I came through it all with hardly a scratch, got nothing more serious than a slight knock on the knee from a piece of shell, and was more or less buried 4 times, but nothing serious enough to send me out on one of the firing lines. I was quite close to Percy Rosewarne of Spring Valley when he was wounded. He joined up in the same 2 or 3 weeks before we went into the big push, as the papers termed it, and was attached to the same company and platoon. He stood the shelling up splendidly for a chap who had never been under it before. It didn't seem to have any effect on him at all. He was not wounded until a couple of days before the battalion was relieved. We were occupying trenches that our lads had just taken in front of the village. Old Fritz was a bit savage at having lost his position and was shelling us for all it was worth. Percy was standing a few yards from me when heavy shrapnel burst right over the top of us. One piece hit the chap alongside of him, killing him instantly. Percy was hit on the side of the neck. It was a pretty ugly wound. I thought at first the main artery was severed, judging from the amount of blood he had. However, on closer examination, we saw that such was not the case. He became unconscious for a while, but after he came round a bit, he was able to walk to the dressing station. I haven't heard since how he's getting along. He should be all right. I suppose he is somewhere in England now. We are going into the trenches in a few days' time. So Percy did return and obviously married Mary Hilda, and Mary and Percy had 3 children. Mary Therese, who was born in July 1935 in Goulburn, and Mary married Dermot O'Neill. They didn't have any children, and Mary died in Townsville in October 2021. Wendell Lawrence was born in December 1937 in Goulburn. He lived with his mother in Goulburn, and he died in January 2018. He did not marry, nor did he have children. There was a child, Edward, that was named in Percy's obituary. However, there are no other records that I can find on Edward Rosewarne at this point. Percy died in 1940, aged only 45, and in the article on his death, it does mention that the wounds that he did receive from World War I contributed to his early death. Moving on to the 4th child of James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald. Annie was born in 1863 and married Michael Conrick, a farmer of Baraja, which is near Corowa. They married in 1880 in Albury when she was 17, and Annie died in Corowa in June 1928 at the age of 65. And the article in the Corowa Free Press of her obituary says, Mrs. Annie Conrick Sr., another of the pioneering residents of the Corowa district in the persons of Mrs. Conrick, relict of the late Michael Conrick of Lowersdale, passed away on Thursday last at the Corowa Hospital, where she'd been under treatment for 4 months preceding her death. The deceased lady was 65 at the time of her death and was the daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. James Grogan of Springhurst, and came to Corowa 48 years ago, and sometime later married Mr. Conrick. About 10 months ago, her health commenced to fail, and it was with a view is giving her the full benefit of proper treatment that she was brought late to the hospital. During her lengthy residence in the district, she made many friends, for she was possessed of a kind and sympathetic nature, and did kindly acts whenever called upon. The late Mrs. Conrick had a record in connection with the World War, of which any Australian mother might justly be proud. In fact, her record of having 5 sons fighting in the Empire's cause would be hard to beat in any district. Unfortunately, one son, Frank, paid the supreme sacrifice when big things were doing in France in 1917. She was survived by a family of 6 sons and 5 daughters. The remains were laid to rest in Corowa New Cemetery on Friday last, the Reverend Father Lawless of Rutherglen officiating at the graveside. So, as was mentioned, Annie and Michael had 10 children, and 5 of their sons served in the military. And I'm going to go through each of those children now. So the firstborn child was James Conrick, and he was born in 1881 in Albury. He enlisted in World War I on the 28th of July 1915. He served in Egypt and was discharged on the 1st of May 1916 due to varicose veins. He married Mary Nation in October 1920 at Gurramatta in Victoria, near Howlong in New South Wales, and they did not have any children. James died in October 1964 in Corowa, aged 83. Second child, Ellen, died in 1882 as a baby. The third child, Catherine, was born at Baraja in 1884, and Catherine married Charles Hall in Victoria in 1912. Charles was from the Warrigal area, and then they moved to Tasmania in about 1918. They had 6 children. Catherine, their eldest child, died in 1919, aged 14 years, at Hobart. The family were living at Glenlusk, which was northwest of Hobart at this time. Catherine died in Tasmania in 1965, aged 81. Francis, or Frank Conrick, was born in 1886 in Corowa, and he died in France on the 23rd of May 1917 at the age of 31, and he is buried at Calais in France. And there is a letter that his youngest sister Alice wrote to him It says to Gunner F. Conrick, 115th Battery, 25th Howitzer Brigade, 5th Division, Egypt, from Lowersdale. Dear Frank, we're all well at home and hope you and Pete are the same. It is very dry here. Jim arrived home all right. He got a welcome. Mother got a letter from you last week. I am still going to school. Jack came to see us. People around here are ploughing now. A lot of men have enlisted since you went away. It is getting very cold over here now. It must be getting hot in Egypt. Molly Jamieson is going to write to Pete tonight. Miss Murray is helping Mr. Watson to teach school. There are a lot of people going away from Burraja. Florrie was in hospital about 2 weeks ago with a bad ear. This is all this time, so I will say goodbye. Love to you and Peter from all your loving sister, Alice. The fifth child, Michael John Conrick, was born in March 1888 at Corowa, and he enlisted in World War I on the 4th of January 1915. He first landed at Gallipoli on the 5th of September 1915. He got Nile fever not long after he arrived, and in November 1916 he got a fracture of the leg. He also got appendicitis in September 1917, and he was fighting in France in 1918. And he returned to Australia on the 28th of March 1919. He married Alice Agnes Mitchell at Corowa in 1924 when he was 36. They had no children, and he died in November 1945, aged 57, at Violet Town. And there's an obituary on Michael. It says, Mr. Michael John Conrick. The death occurred on Thursday, November the 1st at the Wangaratta Hospital of Mr. Michael John Conrick, the third son of the late Michael Conrick of Lowersdale. He served with the 1st AIF, and for many years was on the railway staff at Corowa, and for some time had lived in Tumut. The funeral took place in Violet Town and was of a military character. The burial service was read by Reverend Father Rowan of Numurkah. The deceased leaves a wife, Alice, who was Miss Alice Mitchell of Violet Town. Their sixth child was Thomas Edward Conrick, and he was born in 1889 at Lowersdale. He was initially refused in his first attempt at enlistment, as he had an injury to his right knee, and he stated that he twisted his knee at football nearly 2 years ago, and the army wanted him to have an operation in order for him to be fit, and he refused to have that operation. So when he first enlisted on the 27th of December 1915, they actually refused his application. Clearly, with the fighting and the deaths that occurred of Australian soldiers, there didn't seem to be an issue when he enlisted the second time. He enlisted again on the 14th of August 1917, and he fought in France. He was wounded in action on the 23rd of August 1918, and he was invalidated to England and remained in England in hospital. And he returned to Australia on the 12th of December 1918. He married Ethel White in Corowa, aged 39, in 1928. He was a farmer and died in Parramatta Hospital from injuries from the war in June 1933, aged only 44. And they had no children. And there is an article outlining his death. The death occurred at the Parramatta Hospital on Tuesday last of Mr. Thomas Conrick as a result of injuries that he received in the Great War, which brought on nervous trouble. The term nervous trouble we would consider today to be post-traumatic stress disorder. The late Mr. Conrick was a member of an old and respected family at the Lowersdale district, being the late Mr. and Mrs. Michael Conrick. He was a native of that district, and during the war he served in France as a member of the 3rd Battalion of the AIF and was badly wounded. About 6 months ago he was taken to Parramatta Hospital suffering from nervous trouble brought on as a result of his war injuries, and from that time his health gradually deteriorated until the end came on Tuesday. The deceased gentleman leaves a widow but no family. He's also survived by 4 brothers and 5 sisters. 2 brothers predeceased him, Larry and Frank, who was killed in action. The remains were conveyed from Parramatta by train, beside a large number of relatives and friends. Members of the local branch of the RSL attended to pay their tribute. The service at the graveside was conducted by P.J. O'Reilly, and the last post was sounded by Mr. J. Fiddies. The 7th child was Peter Ryan Conrick, and he was born in May 1891 in Corowa. He enlisted in 1914 and served 2 years in the 4th Battalion in the Artillery Division. He was wounded in action on 2 occasions. He was unmarried and died in July 1941, aged 50, at Heidelberg Military Hospital, and an obituary was in the paper outlining his death. After being an inmate at the Heidelberg Military Hospital, Victoria, for 3 days, the death took place suddenly on Sunday morning, July 18, 1941, of Peter Conrick, 5th son of the late Mr. and Mrs. Conrick of Lowersdale, Corowa. Born at Lowersdale, the deceased spent nearly all his life in the district, and besides being a member of the pioneer family, he was regarded by all who knew him as a great chap. He was single and was for the past 18 months been in the 12th Garrison at North Williamstown. He enlisted in active service in 1914 with his brothers James and Frank. In the Great War, he served 2 years in the 40th Battalion, and afterwards, until the end of the war, was in the Artillery Division. He was wounded in action on 2 occasions. He was predeceased by his father and mother and 3 brothers, Tom, Frank and Larry. The casket will arrive in Corowa today, and the funeral cortege will leave from St Mary's Roman Catholic Church. Members of the Corowa branch of the Returned Soldiers Association will take part in the proceedings and respect the memory of the comrade in arms. The 8th child was Florence May, and she was born in 1893 in Corowa. She married Alfred Barron in March 1925 at Rutherglen at the age of 32. Florence had previously had a child in 1918, aged 25, Lillian Lorraine Conrick, who was born in Corowa. Lillian married William Frederick George Wilson, a baker in Carter, in 1938, and they had 2 children. Lillian died in Wagga in September 2006 and was buried at Hopefield near Corowa. And Florence and Alfred had 4 sons together, none of whom had children. The next child, Annie Teresa, was born in 1895 in Corowa, and she married Arthur True, who was a blacksmith in Corowa in 1914 when she was 19. They had 13 children and lived at Baraja, just out of Corowa, and Annie died in Corowa in September 1958 at the age of 63. Their oldest son, Cyril Francis True, fought in the Middle East and up in the Northern Territory in World War II and was discharged on the 13th of March 1946. Cyril lived in Coonabarabran in 1969. He lived in Myrtlefoot in 1947. He was stated at being at the prison at Bathurst in 1963 and at the Kenmore Mental Hospital in Goulburn in 1974. And Cyril died in New South Wales in 1975, aged 59. Another of Annie's sons, William Arthur George True, enlisted in World War II on the 30th of March 1941 in Corowa and served until June 1946 in New Guinea. He married Ellen Caroline Shriver in Corowa in 1946, and he died in Heidelberg in 1979, aged 59. Another son, Lawrence Leslie True, also enlisted in World War II, and he died in Hay in New South Wales in 1955, aged only 34. Harold, known as Jacko True, served as a Lance Corporal in 1966 in Vietnam in the Royal Australian Corps of Signallers from the 3rd of May 1967 to the 5th of May 1968. The 10th child of the Conricks was William Reginald, and he was born in 1898 in Corowa and died in 1959, aged 61, and he did not marry. The next child was Lawrence Henry Conrick, and he was born in 1900 in Corowa and died in Corowa on the 30th of December 1928. I'm just going to read an article as to the cause of Lawrence's death. Shooting fatality, Baraja resident killed. A shooting fatality occurred near Corrine on Sunday afternoon, the victim being Mr. Lawrence Conrick, a farmer of Baraja. About 4 p.m. on Sunday, in response to a telephone message, Sergeant Morris and Mr. James Conrick, a brother of the deceased, journeyed to Corrine and went to spot on Mr. R. Mackenzie's property, where they saw the body of the deceased with a bullet wound in his right temple, near a fence with a pea rifle in which there was a discharged cartridge lying alongside. Not far from the scene of the accident, a horse and sulky were tied up. From the tracks, it is assumed that the deceased had driven along a track near Mr. Mackenzie's shed and pulled up, intending to shoot rabbits. He tied the horse up and went to get through a wire fence, but apparently the trigger caught in barbed wire, causing the rifle to explode. At the time the discovery was made, the Daysdale telephone was closed. That is the reason why the Corowa police were communicated with. On arrival at the scene of the tragedy, Sergeant Morris sent on to Daysdale for the police and the coroner. On their arrival, the case was handed over and the body removed to the Corrine Hotel. An inquest into the accident will be held at Daysdale on Friday next. The coroner gave an order for burial and the funeral left the Roman Catholic Church Corowa at 3 p.m. yesterday afternoon. The 12th child, Alice Eileen Maud Conrick, was born in 1902 in Corowa. She married John Brown in Corowa in 1944 when she was 42, and she died at Numurkah, Victoria, aged 90. And the youngest child of Annie and Michael Conrick was Margaret Lillian, born December 1906 in Corowa. She married Norman Johnston in Yarrawonga in 1930 at the age of 24, and Norman was a cart driver. They had one child, Margaret, and Margaret died in 1987 in Corowa. So out of 13 children, only 5 of their children went on to have children of their own. And of course we had one of her daughters that had 13 children. So out of all of those children, unfortunately, Michael and Annie had a lot of bad luck, particularly with the fact that they had so many sons at war and the injuries that they succumbed to led to their early deaths. The youngest child of James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald was Francis Patrick Grogan, who was born in March 1965 in Chiltern, Victoria. By the time he was 22, he was living and working at Boree Creek in New South Wales, and he married Annie Verdon on the 7th of January 1892 at Mirunda, a town near Boree Creek, when he was 26 and Annie was 18. Annie's family was featured in episode 10, Vagrancy. Frank and Anne purchased a farm around 1910 at Greenvale, just near Boree Creek, and they named it Adavale. Frank retired in 1920 and moved to Wagga after selling the farm, and he died in June 1932, aged 67. And the article outlining his funeral, Mr. F.P. Grogan. The funeral of Mr. Francis Patrick Grogan of Boree, Edward Street, Wagga, who died at his residence on Thursday at the age of 67, took place yesterday afternoon. The body was taken from the residence on Thursday night to St Michael's Cathedral, from which the funeral moved after prayers had been offered by Reverend Father O'Rourke. The cortege was large and representative, and has included relatives and friends from Lockhart, Boree Creek, Murrabulong, Ardlethan, Wagga, Corowa and Mary Wagga. The interment was in the family enclosure in the Catholic portion of the Wagga Cemetery. The coffin, which was laden with floral tributes, was carried to the grave by James, John and Patrick Grogan, his sons, J. Conrick, nephew, W. Jenkins and F. Langridge, sons-in-law. The pallbearers were his brothers-in-law, and the chief mourners at the graveside were his widow and his daughters. So it's quite clear here that Annie and Frank must have kept in touch. The fact that his nephew attended his funeral is an indicator that they did keep in touch with his brother and sister from childhood, whereas John, James and William, as the article alluded to, William just disappeared into thin air, and there's no record of John James having any connection with his younger siblings. Frank and Annie had 9 children. The first child was William James Francis Grogan, and he was born in July 1893 at Boree Creek. He was known as Jimmy. He was a farmer who enlisted in World War I on the 3rd of November 1914 at Liverpool, Sydney. He was in the 1st Light Horse Regiment at Gallipoli and returned on 7th of July 1919. Upon returning, he went into a business partnership with William Hewson in the Cross Keys Hotel at the corner of Campbell and East Streets in Sydney. Jimmy left this partnership in July 1921, and he married Christina Gardner in Sydney in the same year and became a policeman in January 1922. By 1930, he was working at Annandale in New South Wales as a conduit worker. He enlisted in World War II on the 8th of June 1940 as a corporal in the 2nd Engineering Base Stores Depot and was discharged in October 1948. He died in June 1957 in Petersham, aged 63. Emma May Margaret Grogan was born at Boree Creek in 1895. She married Reginald Wilson in Wagga in 1921, aged 26. They moved to Sydney in 1945 and Emma died there in August 1977 at the age of 82, and they had 2 children, John and Joan. The third child, John Thomas Matthew Grogan, was born in 1896 at Boree Creek. He married Mary Kerr at Wollombi in 1915 at the age of 19. They lived in Orange and then Wagga, where he was a surveyor's labourer. They had 3 children, Mary, John and William. John Thomas also married Ida Constance Jackson in 1937, and he died in Tocumwal in 1945 at the age of only 48. And there is an article outlining his death. Mr. J.T. Grogan. The funeral of Mr. John Thomas Grogan of Tocumwal and formerly of Wagga, who died at Tocumwal on Monday, took place yesterday. The cortege moved from St Michael's Cathedral, Wagga, at 11 o'clock after prayers had been read by the Reverend Father B. Gallagher. The casket was carried by Mr. James and Patrick Grogan brothers, Frank Jones, Charles Maloney and William Payton brothers-in-law, and Edward Dunn. Child number 4 is Eileen Martha Grogan, who was born in May 1899 at Boree Creek, and she's my husband's great-great-grandmother. She married William Rayleigh Jenkins at St Mel's, Narendra, on the 10th of April 1918 when she was 18. William and Eileen moved to Orange for a short time before settling in Berrigan in New South Wales. Eileen bred and raced greyhounds quite successfully until they moved to Melbourne in 1942. Her husband William died in Deniliquin in 1947 when visiting his son Robert, and he was only 52. Eileen died in September 1963 in Elwood, aged 64. They had 6 children. Chronic asthma was the cause of death of at least 2 of the children. Their daughter Margaret Mary Chapman died of an asthma attack only 3 days after her mother died. The 5th child, Patrick Verdon Cornelius Grogan, was born on the 15th of November 1900 at Boree Creek, and he married Mary Robinson in Wagga in 1935 when he was 35. Mary was 10 years younger than Patrick. They had 2 children, Margaret and George, and Patrick died in Wagga in December 1965 at the age of 65. Annie Kathleen Grogan, the 6th child, was born on the 12th of November 1902 at Boree Creek. She married Frederick George W. Langridge in September 1927 at St Brendan's, Annandale, New South Wales, aged 24. Fred was an Englishman and was stationed in the Navy in 1930. He was a storeman in Wagga in 1958. Annie had previously given birth to a daughter that she named Hazel Joyce Grogan, and she was born on the 18th of October 1922 in Annandale when Annie was 20. Remember, this was a very devout Catholic family, and Annie would have quite possibly been sent to Annandale to give birth. And Hazel was adopted out to Martin Healy and his wife Mary, and she was renamed Hazel Mary Therese Healy. Annie and Frederick had 2 children together, Ronald and Patricia, and Annie died in Wagga in 1976, aged 73. The 7th child, Evelyn Teresa Grogan, was born in April 1906 in Narendra, and she died at Lewisham Hospital in Wagga on the 16th of December 1927, aged only 21. The 8th child, Constance Magdalene Grogan, was born in Urana on the 10th of December 1909. She married Francis Jones at St Michael's Cathedral on the 15th of April 1936 in Wagga when she was 26. She was given away by her brother John and attended by her sister Joan. They had no children. Frank was a lorry driver and supervised and trucked primary produce, and Constance died in Wagga in May 1990 at the age of 80. And the 9th and youngest child of the family, Joan Hazel Grogan, was born on the 10th of April 1916 at Wagga. She was only 16 when her father died. She married Thomas Quinn in Sydney in 1942 when she was 26, and Thomas was 58. Thomas was from Urana, and he'd previously been married. He was a baker and a drover. His first wife died in 1927, and he had 4 children from that marriage. In fact, his children, there was only a maximum of 4 years difference in age to Joan. Thomas's youngest daughter was only 2 months younger than Joan. Joan and Tom lived in Wagga, and she died in 1996 at the age of 80. James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald's story still has a number of mysteries to solve. With the trauma of Mary's mental illness and confinement, I'm not certain that the children were brought up solely by their parents. There are clues when looking at the funeral notices and marriages of the children that the siblings don't seem to be mentioned. It certainly seems that the two youngest had a connection of some sort, but it seems that William and John possibly battled with their own demons from the trauma that occurred when they were young children, and quite likely from the further disruptions that they may have had in their early lives. And then if you look at the next generation, so James Grogan and Mary Fitzgerald's grandchildren, they certainly did their bit for the war, and unfortunately for those young men that did go away to war, most of them didn't come away unscathed. And in those days, the members of this family with the incidents of mental illness, they certainly struggled, and as a result, there are quite a few lines of the family where there are no further generations today. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.